Hello everybody, glad to see you back at my bench for a brand new full build video. It has taken me 2 months to complete this fantastic 1/48 scale F-4G Phantom II Wild Weasel from Meng, depicted as she appeared during Operation Southern Watch over Iraq in 1996. Phantom deserves an incredible amount of detail, so I have a lot of things to show you. Let's not waste any more time and dive straight into the fun. To kick things off, we're diving straight into the front office. While the Meng kit is a modern tool, its plastic relief can't quite compete with the crisp definition of Quinta Studio 3D Decal set. After surgically removing the molded on plastic details, I'm layering in the Eduard photo etched panels using Ammo Ultra Glue. For the base color, I'm spraying the standard dark ghoul grey to add some contrast. I've picked up the processor boxes in metallic black. And electronic warfare officer side panels in NATO black. With that ready, I can apply the instrumental panels from the 3D Decal set. They are designed to adhere on their own, but I'm adding a bit of ultra glue as a safety measure since I don't sand the kit surface down to an absolute flat level. The glue fills those microscopic gaps and ensures these decals won't pop off during the final assembly. I found Quinta radar screens a bit too dark for my liking, so a touch of clear green over the 3D decals gives them a bit of that authentic 1990s phosphor glow, the true heart of the Wild Weasel APR-47 system. Before we seal the cockpit inside the fuselage, I'm giving the panels a light touch of weathering. Since the seats and the absolute jungle of cables will cover most of the floor, I'm focusing on some subtle metallic dry brushing and a simple panel line wash on the high traffic areas. The F-4G, the Wild Weasel, essentially a flying laboratory, which means it's packed to the brim with electronics. I'm using Ennis resin connectors to detail the processor boxes behind the seats, which I've painted with a gunmetal marker for a cold metallic finish. I'm starting the wiring here while the cockpit is still outside the airframe to ensure I can route the cables accurately from the hardware. I'm leaving these leads loose to connect properly later on. Now we can move to the airframe itself. To make room for the extra detail, I have to clear the deck. I'm removing the simplified cables Meng molded behind the seats. With a clean surface, I can install these Eduard Canopy seal structures. These represent the locking lugs and the structural race where the canopy hooks actually bite into the fuselage. Most kits ignores this area entirely, but in 1/40 scale that lip is vital for a realistic look once the canopy is post open. This is where the build truly comes to life, the cable jungle. Behind the seats I'm installing the main wiring harnesses using a mix of black painted and natural silver lead wire. By connecting the wires from the fuselage walls to the processors we detailed earlier, we create a seamless web of electronics. Some of the remaining cables will just hang loose behind the seat section and along the sides. In a real Phantom, many of those wires actually disappear into the light side canvas shielding of the darkness behind the seat bulkhead anyway. It's a messy, high-density look that is the absolute hallmark of a combat-ready Phantom. After placing the control stick, I will focus on the throat combing. I remove the base for the kit's hot stand and replace it with much more detailed, thinner version from Edward's photo etch set. After a layer of black, I'm adding a couple of micro-sized 3D decals. And now for the lens, I'm using holographic nail foil here instead of painted plastic or PE part. It catches the light beautifully and adds striking eye-catching detail. And lastly, a matching piece of foil goes onto the hot stand. Now that the cockpit is packed with fragile fires, I want to immediately protect it for the next stages of work by installing the canopy. The central windshield panel of F4 was made of very thick multi-layer sandwich of glass and polycarbonate. It wasn't tint for looks. The greenish cyan hue is a natural result of the extreme thickness of the armored glass. I will paint it with a custom mix of clear and blue to achieve more blue-green look rather than pure green. Before continuing with painting, I need to remove the prominent seam lines running down the center of the main clear frames. It is not as pronounced as also many other kits, but it is still a bit distracting to me. The process is simple and straightforward. With a brand new razor sharp blade, I carefully scrape off the seam line, and now comes the sanding process broken down into several sequential steps. First, dry sanding with a 3000 grit sanding mat. Then I transition to Tamiya Compound Fine paired with 6000 grit sanding cloth. Next up is Tamiya Compound Finish worked with an 8000 grit cloth. And lastly, a final polish with Tamiya Wax. The result? A completely crystal clear canopy with no seam line left behind. And now we can move to the paint, starting with the interior NATO black. On the outside, I also want to paint the prominent fiberglass sealant lines. I'm using Edward's mask here, which provides two separate exterior sets exactly for this reason. I'm trying to keep the distance between the mask and the frame as narrow as possible. After initial masking, I paint the edges of the clear glass with a mix of sand gray to mimic faded weathered look. Then I remask the entire canopy with the second set covering the painted sealant lines as well. Now I can place the canopy onto the fuselage frame to protect the cockpit. The main painting phase will come later. With the office wired and the structures in place, I've laid the perfect foundation. Next we need to address the most prominent part of the interior, the Martin Baker ejection seats. Before we move to the resin, let's look at the kit seats. I have to give Meng credit here. The molded detail is probably best you can get from the standard injection molded plastic. But for a build at this level, I'm opting for the Edward 3D printed resin. Even though these were originally designed for the Hasegawa kit with a little dry fitting, they provide a perfect upgrade for our Wild Weasel. offering a level of sharpness plastic just can't replicate. The Martin Baker MKH7 is a project in itself. I'm starting by adding the small resin subcomponents and the initial photo etch details. Following my reference, I'm also adding some fine lead wire to replicate the oxygen and communication leads before heading to the paint. I'm starting with a base of NATO black for the main frame. For the fabric I'm using Vallejo khaki for the survival pack seat cushions and olive drab for the parachute pack at the top. Since this is one of Eduard's classic sets, it relies on photo etched for the place cards rather than decals. I'm using one of the unpainted PE part as a stencil to airbrush the cushion lift warning directly onto the seat fabric. After a coat of matte varnish, I'm using watercolor pencils to add some sun fading and wear to the fabric. These jets lift in the desert, so they shouldn't look brand new. A light metallic dry brushing brings out the mechanical details of the metal frame. Moving on to the harness and straps, and there are a lot of them. This is where the seat really starts to look busy. I'm always carefully to glue down the ends of the seat belts with the super glue to avoid that unrealistic rigid floating effect you sometimes see with a stiff photo etched. At the end of my belt session, I realized I couldn't fit the iconic yellow and black ejection pull handles above the hard rest because the resin loops on the parachute pack were too thick. I had to replace them with thin paper-based alternatives, which I fabricated by painting 1mm wide masking tape. With the seats finished, we can call the cockpit complete. And we can move on to the intakes. The first thing to notice are the ugly ejection pink marks on the interior trunk parts, which need to be sanded flush before we move to assembly. After gluing the halves together, we are left with prominent seam lines down the joints. It goes without saying that the aircraft intakes need to be completely seamless, so we need to eliminate them. I fill the gaps with liquid MRP filler. Because it's highly fluid, it fills the small gaps much more easily than traditional thick putty. Instead of going to sanding, I will try to remove the excess putty using levering thinner on a cotton bud. I'm not sure yet what the result will be, but it's worth trying. With a bit of luck, we can save hours of awkward sanding inside these narrow trunks. Surprisingly, the result looks fantastic, so I will give it just a very light sanding session to polish the surface. To test the final result, I will spray the interiors with a white surfacer. The result looks great. The combination of MRP filler and surfacer completely closed the seams, they are no longer visible. So after the prime and drying, I painted the trunks and all interior parts with insignia white, which is a slightly warmer yellowish worn look, much better than the sterile factory fresh pale white. For the intake trunks leading edges, I need to clean up the exterior joints after assembly. I also want to pre-paint the fuselage facing areas, which will be nearly impossible to access later. To avoid any unpainted spots, I briefly pre-shade them in dark colors as they aren't exposed to sun fading, and then spray them in haze grey. Next, we need to tackle the auxiliary intakes on the belly. These are commonly known as blown-in doors. They are critical for F-Force operations when the engines demand more air than the main intakes can provide, usually during taxiing or high alpha low speed maneuvers. These doors open automatically to increase airflow. Without them, the hungry J-79s would essentially starve. So we finished the mouth for the hungry engines, and now let's have a look at the exhaust parts. Once again, I need to give credit to Meng for the nicely detailed nozzles and cans provided in the box. However, I'm automatically buy aftermarket resin for almost all the kits I built, so I'm using the Edward set here. The 3D print is much finer and the interior parts are less pronounced, though out of the box nozzles are definitely solid as well. I start by spraying all parts in black as a base coat, and after straightforward airbrush job for the interior, the most entertaining part comes with the Afterburner cans. I start from the inside with a creamy base color followed by white, sprayed in light layers to create some realistic pre-shading. The final step is a light coat of burnt iron. For the outer nozzle petals, I use an exhaust metal color, which has a distinct grey-purple tone, matching what I've seen in reference photos of operational Phantoms. That's just the base, though the edges of the petals need to be painted with burnt iron. I'm using the Ganze version here, as the MRP burnt iron will be reserved for the petals themselves. There is only a minor difference in shade, but it's a nuance worth the effort. The rivets on the edges are naturally shinier, so I paint them one by one with a silver brush. Then I seal the entire nozzle set with a clear gloss varnish. This step is super important for what comes next, the weathering. I give the outer cans a heavier layer of dark grey enamel wash and pure black on the internal trunks. This sits on the clear varnish perfectly. The enamel wash doesn't blend in with the underlying paint, making it easy to clean up the excess using enamel thinner. Then I add some heat stains using an AK wash designed for engines and exhausts. To create the faded burned effect on the inside of the trunks and cans, I mix the exhaust pigment with odorless thinner and apply it with a brush. Again, I can easily blend and remove the excess with odorless thinner afterward. I apply another layer of varnish to protect the work, and then I add burnt, ashy stains on the inside of the petals using oil paints. Obviously, this small exhaust project took around a week to complete, as each step needed its own proper drying time while running parallel with the rest of the build. But the J79 cans are too iconic to rush. How many Phantoms will you build in your career anyway? 4, 5, 6? Not many more. So enjoy the process and build them exactly the way you want, taking the extra time to capture the complex metallic layers of the signature exhaust was easily one of the most rewarding parts of the entire project. That finishes the inside, which requires a dead flat look, so another layer of matte varnish goes onto the internal parts. On the outside of the cans, I add some final wear with oil paints. The last remarkable touches are needed on these movable feathers, which routinely suffer from scratches, so I'm adding them using a watercolor pencil. Now we move on to the gear base. They are mostly white, so I have already sprayed them with Mr. Color Off-White. Now I will add more depth by highlighting the complex maze of cables, hydraulic hoses and electronic boxes. I am painting the various boxes with a custom mix of sky grey and white to give them a slightly different shade than the pure white surroundings. And we can now assemble the structural parts together. It's highly satisfying, almost like playing with Lego. I will immediately weather the nose gear bay using a dark grey wash. I'll work on the main gear bays later since their sealing is molded directly onto the wing interior. I need to wait until the complete airframe assembly. The G Wild Weasel version of Phantom is a dedicated suppression of enemy air defenses variant for the US Air Force, updated with advanced radar and avionics and converted from an older F-4E airframes. Meng has released this kit tooling in several versions, including the US Air Force E, the Turkish Terminator, and earlier this year, the Greek AUP version, so you can basically find 4 different boxings sharing this similar excellent kit. We are looking at almost all the parts I need to put together on the main body before painting. The low number of pieces here promises a fast build. I will start with the metallic tail section and the horizontal stabilizers. Meng engineered a rather strange mounting mechanism, but more importantly, they want us to attach the stabilizers to the body at this early stage. This is extremely impractical given the need for heavy masking on the stabilizers during the metallizing of the tail section. I will be practical and glue the tail section to the upper fuselage without the stabilizers attached and just hope I can fit them in properly at the very end. Let's see how the gamble plays out. Now we move to attach all sub-assemblies to the body, starting with the wheelbase, and then I'm completing the wing structures. Next are the resin exhaust nozzle adapters attached securely with superglue. The cans themselves I will keep separate for the final assembly to avoid extensive masking. Finally, we can close up the fuselage halves. It doesn't go together perfectly. A massive amount of pressure is needed to join the halves in some positions. I really need to proceed patiently, taking very small steps. I was hoping to close her up in under an hour, but I ended up spending that whole time just dry fitting the parts. The fitting issues were relatively minor, but still needed some extensive sanding along the joints, especially around the lower engine contours. And then, of course, I had to rescribe the damaged panel lines as well, but this time I will skip this step from the video, as there are much more interesting parts of the process still ahead of us. While the standard fighter variants of Phantom were phased out of active duty in the US, the specialized Wild Weasel remained irreplaceable. During the Gulf War in 1991, they proved so vital that the strike groups refused to fly into the hostile territory without their protection. In the subsequent years of the 1990s, these XZ jets patrolled the tense skies over Iraq, acting as a permanent aggressive shields against the defiant air defense network. Because the massive electronic suit under the radar warning system completely replaced the internal nose cannon, crews jokingly refer to F-4Gs as the only Phantom that fought its enemies using nothing but mouth and microchips. Important add-on for a realistic Wild Weasel are the reinforcement stripes which go on the belly and the vertical stabilizers. I am using the 3D printed resin parts from the flying leatherneck as they featured gorgeous surface detail and perfectly raised rivets. These external steel plates were retrofitted to the fleet because decades of pulling violent, low-altitude maneuvers while evading enemy radars caused the massive weak sections to suffer from structural metal fatigue. To complete the vertical stabilizers, Meng provided photo-etched parts for the fuselage reinforcement plates. And the last step of the main assembly is to attach the tail top. And we can move on to the painting stage. First I gave the Phantom a base coat of grey primer, which will get a heavy multi-layered pre-shade for that final worn and faded look. This G Wild Weasel version of the Phantom was an upgrade converted from the existing F-4E fleet, so her lifetime in service was relatively long. The two-tone hill-to camouflage scheme used in Persian Gulf was newly painted at the time, yet the blistering desert sun and abrasive sandy conditions must be reflected heavily on that coat. The nickname Wild Weasel stems from a secret Vietnam-era program dedicated to destroying enemy surface-to-air missile threats. The name perfectly mirrors the behavior of the fierce little mammal, a creature that enters the enemy's den to hunt down deadly prey. This legendary lineage evolved through 4 previous generations of converted fighter aircraft, starting with the F-100F and scaling up through F-105s and early F-4Cs variants, before culminating in our ultimate 5th generation Wild Weasel platform, the F-4G. In aviation terms, it birthed the lethal concept of suppression of enemy air defense, where a crew explicitly flies into danger to bait enemy radars into turning the hunters into the hunted. Still, I really like the Hill 2 scheme, with its combination of gunship grey and medium or haze grey. With this complex pre-shade, I want to break up the uniformity of the main tactical colors into organic, different shades. The panel lines on the actual Wild Weasel are nearly invisible in most operational conditions, so I will paint with black just those specific areas which suffer most from the heavy fluid dirt, which I recognize on several combat pictures. But before I move on to the main camouflage paint and some details, I will take care of the metallic tail and stabilizers part. I think it's much easier to paint them now and mask them off from the main paint, rather than protecting the whole plane from the metallic misting if I were to do the camouflage first. The unpainted titanium and steel structure around the exhaust area wasn't just for the show. It had to withstand temperatures soaring past 800 degrees Celsius. She required a complex internal network of cooling air scoops just to keep the aluminum tail section from melting during sustained supersonic flights. After painting different metallic shades on the upper part, the lower bare metal part I spray with super iron. Meng actually did a wonderful piece of engineering here by molding these prominent structural ribs, which you won't find on some older kits, and this ribbing needs additional effort to stand out. In Meng's case, it drove me to the decision to dry brush the ribs. A long time ago I bought this metallic wax from AK Interactive, which I had never used, but I think this is the perfect place for it. I mixed the gunmetal wax with a touch of burnt umber oil paint and dry brushed the high ribs. Then I used a toothpick to precisely wipe off the simulated dirt on the low ribs. I love how these details look. It takes good lighting to truly see the difference. We modelers all suffer from working under artificial lighting at night, right? So I'm sealing the entire metallic section with satin varnish to avoid any accidental touch-ups or lifting of the wax and oil paints during the next stage of work. And now for the camouflage, I am applying the definitive Hill 2 low visibility scheme, a tactical tone to finish developed late in the Cold War. Unlike older schemes with a stark light underbelly, Hill 2 was a full wrap-up around the pattern where gunship grey dominates the middle section, the entire underside and the horizontal stabilizers, while the lighter medium grey is reserved for the nose, forward fusage and the vertical tail fin. By 1996, this scheme even dictated the deletion of large, high visibility markings like the colorful refueling guidelines seen on newer jets, reducing the airframe's marking to nothing more than ghosted national insignia and sea of microscopic data stencils. Although the main camouflage layout is quite straightforward, the real magic of a Phantom is the contrast against the metallics. I'm still missing the vertical stabilizers bare metal plates, but the first thing I want to recreate here are those faded panel lines probably a sealant compound that turns a light gray color over time. So I painted those lines first with light ghost gray, then masked them off using masking fluid. I found it easier to paint the detail color and mask it here first, so I can smoothly lay down the gunship gray main camouflage over top. And now back to the stabilizers metallics. The front parts I painted with super titanium, while the middle section is much darker, so I mixed super iron with steel. And the last part is whitest, so it gets a clean coat of super duralium. And with that done, I can finally seal the entire paint job with a protective layer of gloss varnish and get ready for the decals. The decals from the Meng's box are printed by Cartograf, which is always a great guarantee that they will settle beautifully into the panel lines. But the funny part comes right at the beginning of the instructions. Meng's manual incorrectly instructs you to place the US star and bars national insignia on the upper right wing, which is a flat out wrong. For a split second I actually wondered if I had messed up my previous US aircraft builds, but without any doubt the upper national insignia belongs exclusively on the left wing. Technically, this jet was less of a fighter and more of a complex tactical computer. By removing the nose canyon, engineers spec'd the front of the aircraft with a revolutionary radar attack warning system. This massive suite of sensitive internal antenna allowed the engineer or warfare officer in the backseat to detect, categorize and pinpoint enemy radar signals from any direction, instantly feeding the target data directly into the anti-radiation missiles slung under the wings. So after all the decals were set perfectly with the help of Microset and Microsol, I gave them a protective layer of gloss followed by a smooth satin varnish coat to unify the sheen. Maybe you noticed I didn't place the kit's decals for the formation slime lights. I want to paint them instead. I have this fluorescent yellow paint which I never actually used before, so let's try it out. After masking the frames, I sprayed the lights with a flat white as a base color to give the fluorescent paint some real visual punch. And then comes the fluorescent yellow. However, the raw paint is incredibly bright, which would look a bit artificial on an operational Phantom, so I'm toning it down and tinting with a touch of flat white. And now should come the magic. Let me check it right away. Under a UV torch, the light should glow. What a great little moments of hobby joy. To get ready for a final stage, we need to complete one more major subassembly. The Phantom needs to be heavy loaded, otherwise it completely loses that aggressive iconic silhouette. So the next step is to prepare what makes her dangerous. But first, the hungry engines need to be well fed, so I will mount one external fuel tank from Meng's kit on the central line pylon. Next is the electronic countermeasure spot. For a mid-1990s jet, the correct choice is the longer AN ALQ119 pot provided in the box rather than the bulkier 131. This pod is a deep coverage jamming system designed to deceive enemy radar networks. Operated directly by electronic warfare officer in the back seat, it provides a vital layer of self-protection when flying directly into hostile air defense sectors. In the post-Gulf War context of Operation Southern Watch, keeping the system active was crucial for survival against the defiant radar network. I have painted it light ghost grey, as the white scheme recommended by Meng was more accurate for 1980s loadouts. By 1990s, maintenance crews painted them to match the standard low visibility camouflage so they wouldn't stand out in the combat. And we can move on to the air-to-air coverage, starting with the AM-7M Sparrow missiles. I'm using a highly detailed resin set from Reskit here. These missiles represent the primary medium-range defense for the Wild Weasel fleet, upgraded with an inverse monopulse radar seeker for improved low-altitude tracking and better countermeasures resistance. The M variant was the standard during 1990s operations. While the F-4G's primary mission was hunting radar installations, a pair of these recessed under the fuselage ensured the crew could protect themselves from rough interceptors. The operational doctrine of the crew was built on pure adrenaline and cold calculation. Flying low and fast to hide below radar coverage, they would suddenly pop up directly into the envelope of enemy surface-to-air missiles. It was a high-stake game of a chicken. The crew relied entirely on their electronic countermeasure spots to blind incoming missiles, while rushing to launch a radar-homing missile down the throat of the enemy transmitter before the operators could switch it off and vanish into the desert floor. Next are the AGM-88 HARM missiles. I plan to use the set from Reskit, but unfortunately there were several parts missing in my aftermarket box, so I needed to go back to Meng's plastic. The kit missiles are still beautifully detailed anyway. These HARMs are the absolute primary thief of the F-4G Wild Weasel mission, designed to home in on enemy air defense radar emissions. They can strike targets even if the operators switch their transmitters off mid-flight. And the last ones are the AGM-65 Mavericks. To make a long story short, I had also planned to use the set from Reskit, but due to a late stage accident with fragile launch rails, I had to pivot and build the missiles and launchers from the Meng's box instead. Wild Weasels routinely carried these strip rails on a Slang 2 configuration, leaving the inboard station closest to the fuselage completely empty. If a missile were loaded there, the violent rocket exhaust upon the launch would scorch the fuselage and damage the landing gear doors. I am building the infra-guided Maverick variant here in the light ghost grey finish, which was standard ordnance used in 1990s Wild Weasel in the Persian Gulf operations. These specific tactical missiles utilize an imaging infrared seeker head, allowing the crew to acquire and lock onto the ground targets through heavy smoke or desert haze. It gives the Wild Weasel a precision punch to visually destroy a radar vehicle after its signal has been suppressed by a harm. With that done, the weapons and the airframe are completely ready for the weathering stage. The pre-shading and base paint already makes this Phantom look quite well worn, so the weathering stage should be fast. First I will highlight the panel lines with well diluted mix of starfish field, oil paint and a drop of blue. But then I remove the most of the oil wash with odorless thinner, leaving only the necessary amount of dark paint inside the panel lines and rivets. Those were not heavily visible on the real planes, and leaving them too pronounced would lead to an toy-like appearance. I am flooding the lower exhaust area with sepia to create a brownish film over the paintwork, beautifully imitating the intense heat radiation from the engines. And with sepia, I'm also touching up the metallic tail area, whipping away the excess with thinner to leave some light, realistic brownish staining around the panel lines on the bare metal. Now to the horizontal stabilizers. There are highly visible darker structural rips and rivets lining running across the metallic areas, which I will replicate using sepia oil. Next up, a bit of fluid leaks and dirt accumulation on the belly and right behind the auxiliary air intakes. And I'll apply the same treatment to the wings, especially along the slats. What still worries me are the wing walk areas, which look uncomfortably uniform straight from the decals. First, I will tone them down with oils. And then, after the oil paint dries, I will work the areas over with watercolor pencils. The goal is to break up the uniformity and create some random dirty patches. Most important for me is to fade those flat black outline borders. They look extremely artificial on the model, as there was no chance they stayed clean flat black in active service. At this point I noticed I forgot to paint the small metallic button on the rudder pod under the nose. And the final step of the weathering process is the exhaust staining. And that's all for weathering, just enough for my taste. We can move on to complete her. The moment I've been waiting for all month is finally here, putting on the exhaust cans. Here it is. After the flaps, we can quickly attach the auxiliary intake doors. And next we can finish and install the landing gear legs. And the nose gear leg. And while we have her flipped upside down, we can move right along to the Ordnance, starting with the central line fuel tank. the ECM pod, and the Sparrows. And here comes the headache. When test fitting the pylons for Mavericks and Harms, I realized that the raised reinforcement plates on the wings push the pylon upward, creating an ugly, massive gap between the pylon base and the wing skin. The only solution is to carefully cut away sections of the plates directly underneath the pylon footprints, allowing them to sit completely flush against the wings. Done, and the wings are ready for their loaded pylons. And we can finally turn the plane right side up to install the long-awaited horizontal stabilizers. I almost forgot how terrified I was to cut into Meng's mounting mechanism a month ago. Now mounting them is straightforward and completely trouble-free. Well, probably not the brightest idea to leave this for this moment, but I decided now to make these worn panel lines a bit finer. Much better. And let's get back to the slots. We still have the position lights to paint. And we can move right back to where the entire build started, the cockpit and the canopy. I can mask off the pilots and EWO canopy sections. There are minor fixes needed where a little bit of a black paint bled through the masks, but it's no big issue. It is easily cleaned up with a touch of levering thinner on a brush. Here are the rear view mirrors. The real aircraft featured 3 for the pilot and 2 for the electronic warfare officer. And finally, here come the seats. Now I'm coming full circle, handling the very part from the beginning of this entire build. And we are successfully heading down the home stretch. I really enjoyed the process. The kit is fantastic, and of course, the Phantom is an absolute legend that deserves every single second of attention I gave it over the last 2 months. I'm already looking forward to build another one in the future. I hope you liked the build and the video as much as I did, and I want to thank you all for watching. I would be incredibly grateful for your likes and comments, or even super thanks if that option is available for you. Every single bit of engagement helps a small channel like mine, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of my future builds. And here she is, the F-4G Phantom II Wild Weasel.